The great hall had always smelled of bread and candle wax, and the old, damp stone of a castle that refused to admit it was tired. Tonight it stank of smoke, scorched cloth, and the metallic sweetness of blood cooling on flagstones. Harry lay where he'd fallen, not because he had chosen it, not because he had bravely stepped forward into the light of the dais, but because there was nowhere left to step. The air itself felt heavy, as if the castle had drawn in a breath it could not release. Around him, the surviving defenders were herded into a broken half-circle, wandless or too stunned to lift their arms, a human fence made of exhaustion and terror. He could taste ash on his tongue. It crunched between his teeth when he swallowed. Voldemort stood above them all, and Harry had never seen him so still. No manic pacing, no flaring nostrils, no show of temper that made him seem almost human in its spite. He was a pale, narrow monument, his long fingers resting on the Elder Wand as if it were a king's staff, and he had always been meant to hold it. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to force everyone to lean into it. Enough. The word fell like a slab of stone. The last stuttering spells died in the rafters. Somewhere, a torch guttered and spat, as though even fire flinched. Harry tried to move. His body answered in fragments, a twitch of fingers, a dragging breath that scraped his ribs, a throb in his scar that was more memory than pain. He could not find his wand. He could not find Ron's voice, or Hermione's hand, or any part of the world that felt like it belonged to him. There was only this, the dais, the pale face, the wand that had been worshipped like a myth, and now looked horribly ordinary in the wrong grip. Voldemort's gaze found Harry with the slow certainty of a knife selecting its place. "You," Voldemort said, and the syllable carried contempt and relief in the same breath, as if Harry were both nuisance and destination. "Always you." Harry managed to push up on one elbow. The effort sent sparks of nausea through him. Dust clung to the damp skin of his face. His glasses were gone. The world swam, blurred at the edges, a smear of shapes and torches and bodies. In the blur, he saw movement at Voldemort's side. Bellatrix, smiling with split lips. Lucius, thin and white. Narcissa, rigid as ice. He also saw something else, and it was the most terrifying part. Draco, not triumphant, not sneering, but standing behind his mother like a boy who had wandered into an execution and realized he was watching himself. Harry tried to speak. He didn't know what he meant to say. "Sorry. Run. Die. I'm still here." Nothing came out but a harsh breath. Voldemort raised the Elder Wand. The hall went utterly silent, the sort of silence that comes before a storm breaks. Harry felt a strange calm settle over him, not bravery but inevitability, like stepping off a curb you hadn't seen. He thought of his mother's hands, the scent of her hair. He thought of a cupboard under the stairs and sunlight on the Burrow's kitchen table. He thought of the first time he'd walked into this hall and believed, foolishly, that belonging was a place you could earn. Green light erupted from the wand. It struck him squarely. There was no pain, not at first, only a violent sense of being emptied, as if something had been hooked inside his chest and yanked free. For a fraction of a heartbeat he heard a sound, thin, desperate, inhuman, like an infant's cry caught in a throat that didn't have lungs. Then, everything went white. He did not fall so much as the world slid away from him. The great hall's heat, its smoke, its noise, his own heartbeat, all of it dissolved. For a moment he was nowhere and everywhere, weightless as ash. He saw, impossibly, a thing curled on the floor of that whiteness. Small and broken and wrong, like a shadow that had been given flesh and then abandoned. It twitched. It made that sound again. Harry's stomach turned with a revulsion deeper than fear. He knew it without knowing how. That thing was not him, but it had lived inside him. It had squatted behind his ribs and peered out through his eyes. It had whispered in his scar for years. And now it was dying. Something warm wrapped around him, Not hands but a presence, an anchor. A pulse that was not his heartbeat but answered it anyway. He thought, dimly, of blood in a cauldron, of a graveyard and cold hands, of Voldemort saying bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. No, not enemy. Not this way. The white cracked. Darkness seeped in like ink. Harry felt himself falling back toward pain and gravity. He woke to cold stone pressing into his spine and the taste of iron in his mouth. He could not open his eyes. He could not lift a finger. But he could hear a high, delighted laugh. Bellatrix thought, "He's dead," Voldemort said, almost conversationally. Feet approached. A woman knelt beside him. Harry recognized the faint, expensive scent. Something floral and sharp, like crushed petals in snow. Narcissa's hand touched his cheek with a gentleness that did not belong in this hall. Her fingers slid to the side of his throat. Harry held himself absolutely still. He did not know why. Instinct. Reflex. The last scraps of survival he'd learned in places smaller than this. Her fingertips trembled once, a tiny betrayal. Then she leaned closer, so close that her breath brushed his ear. "Is Draco alive?" she whispered, so softly it might have been prayer. Harry could not answer. He could not even make his lungs obey. Narcissa pulled back. For a heartbeat, the entire war balanced on the line of her mouth. Then she lifted her head and looked up at Voldemort. "He is dead," she said clearly. Voldemort's satisfaction rolled through the hall like a wave. Somewhere, someone sobbed. Someone else let out a sound that might have been a prayer or a curse. Voldemort lifted his arms, and the torches flared as though they worshipped him. "It is finished," he said. "Britain is mine." Harry lay in the wreckage, hearing the world declare his ending, and understood with a sick, stunned clarity that Voldemort had won, because everyone believed he had. They moved the bodies at dawn because even monsters preferred their trophies in daylight. Harry felt the lift under his shoulders and knees as if through layers of water. He drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments, through hands, a clatter of armor, a muttered spell to bind wrists, someone complaining about blood on their boots. Once, his head lolled, and his cheek scraped something sharp. A jolt of pain flared, bright enough to pull him up toward consciousness, only to drop him again. He learned, without intending to, the sound of victory. It was not cheering. There was no wild joy, no release. There were orders and footsteps, and the mechanical efficiency of people who had waited years to be allowed to do what they always wanted. It was paperwork spoken aloud. Names, counts, destinations. The dead were not honored. They were inventory. They laid him with others in the courtyard, under a sky the color of old steel. The air smelled of wet ash. Rain began to fall, timid at first, then steady, spattering his face. He could not flinch. He could not swallow. He listened to drops striking stone and thought, absurdly, of summers at the Burrow, of gnomes in the garden and Molly Weasley shouting about mud tracked through her kitchen. A boot nudged his ribs. "This one's lighter than I expected," a voice said, bored. "Potter," someone replied, as though that explained everything. "Leave him. The Dark Lord's done with him." Harry wanted to laugh. The urge rose in him like bile, and he choked on it. Done with him. As if he were a task completed, a box ticked. The footsteps retreated. Voices dwindled. The rain thickened. Time slid strangely. He might have been there minutes or hours. He might have been there long enough for the castle to mourn, for the stones to remember every scream and store them. His body was numb. His mind was bright and horrible, too awake to retreat into darkness again. Then the air changed. A presence approached that was not a Death Eater's swagger or a soldier's hurry. It was careful, irritated, determined. Someone who knew how to move in darkness without thinking it made them powerful. Hands touched Harry, older hands, calloused, smelling faintly of goat and tobacco. The grip under his arms was firm, as if Harry were a sack of grain and the world could not afford to spill him. A low voice hissed, "Merlin's, why are you still breathing?" Harry couldn't answer. His throat refused. The man hoisted him up with a grunt. Harry's head lolled. For an instant, his eyelids fluttered, and he saw a blur of a face. Rough beard, deep-set eyes, anger carved into every line. Aberforth. He'd seen him only in snatches before. Hogshead, grumbling, impatient. Not someone Harry had ever thought of as savior. Aberforth moved fast, taking the shadowed path between broken walls, keeping to collapsed archways where the light from torches couldn't reach. Harry heard distant voices, the scrape of boots, the metallic jingle of a patrol. Aberforth paused, pressed Harry's limp body against the stone, and muttered an oath so heartfelt it sounded like a prayer. When the patrol passed, he moved again, dragging Harry into the mouth of a narrow passage half hidden behind a tumbled statue. Cool air breathed out, stale and underground. Aberforth shoved aside loose stone with practiced ease, revealing a door that should not have existed in solid wall. The secret tunnel swallowed them. Harry's awareness sharpened as the stone around him closed like a throat. Damp pressed against his skin. He caught the scent of old earth, of spilled ale, of something animal. Aberforth's shoulder dug into Harry's stomach as he shifted him for balance. "You stupid, stubborn boy," Aberforth muttered, voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere to go. "You just had to." The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, twisting under the castle and the village like a vein. Harry could hear Aberforth's breathing, harsh with effort, and the occasional clink of something in his pocket. The world above them was changing by the second. The world below was ancient and indifferent. At last, they emerged into dim light that smelled of beer and smoke. The Hogshead's back room, bare and cramped. Aberforth dumped Harry onto a narrow bed. The mattress springs squealed in protest. Harry lay there, soaked and shivering, while Aberforth stood over him with the expression of a man who had spent a lifetime refusing to be surprised, and was furious to find the universe had succeeded anyway. Aberforth wiped rainwater from Harry's face with the edge of his sleeve. He stared at the lightning-shaped scar, as if it were a problem he could solve by glaring. "You're not dead," he said, like an accusation. Harry's lips parted. The first sound that came out was not words, but a broken, helpless gasp. He tried again. Aberforth leaned in, close enough that Harry could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. "Don't waste breath," he growled. "Save it. You'll need it." From the bar out front came muffled voices, laughter too loud, the sound of men congratulating themselves. Victory drinking. In the back room, Harry stared at the cracked ceiling and felt the truth settle into him, heavy as stone. The world believed he was dead. And for the first time since he was 11, that fact might be the only thing keeping him alive. Harry slept for a day and a night, and another day. Not the heavy sleep of healing, but the brutal, empty shutdown of a body that had been pushed past its right to keep functioning. When he woke, it was to thirst so sharp it felt like glass in his throat. Aberforth shoved a chipped cup into his hands. "Drink." Slowly. The water was room temperature and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the best thing Harry had ever swallowed. He drank until his hands stopped shaking. His fingers looked wrong, too thin, too pale, as if they belonged to someone else. When he tried to sit up, the world tilted. Aberforth caught his shoulder, steadying him with surprising gentleness. "You'll live," Aberforth said, as if he were annoyed by the inconvenience. Harry swallowed. "Everyone. Don't. Aberforth's voice hardened. "You'll drown in that if you start now." The door opened without a knock. Hermione slipped in first, wand raised. Her eyes were bright with panic, her cheeks smeared with grime. Ron followed, moving like he was holding himself together by sheer stubbornness, his cloak torn at the shoulder, one sleeve stiff with dried blood. Ginny came last, jaw clenched so tightly, Harry could see the muscle twitch. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at him. Then Hermione made a strangled sound that was half sob, half laugh, and crossed the room in 3 steps. She stopped short of the bed as if afraid she might break him just by touching. Her hands hovered in the air, trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, you're—" "Apparently not," Harry said hoarsely. His voice didn't sound like his own. It scraped like something dragged over stone. Ron's face crumpled with a relief so fierce it looked like pain. He turned away abruptly, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand like he was furious at himself for doing it. Ginny didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside the bed and grabbed Harry's hand in both of hers. Her grip was strong, anchoring. "You idiot," she said, voice thick. "You absolute." Her throat worked. The words wouldn't come. She pressed her forehead to his knuckles for a moment, breathing hard. Harry stared at them, at the bruises and cuts, at Hermione's split lip, at Ron's swollen eye, at Ginny's trembling shoulders, and felt something inside him twist. He tried to pull his hand free gently, not because he didn't want the contact, but because it made the guilt sharper. "Is everyone else?" he began again. Hermione's expression tightened. She nodded once, quickly, as if the motion cost her something. "Some got out, some didn't. Neville?" She swallowed. "Neville was taken. Luna too. They're keeping Hogwarts open, a show, a prison with lessons." Ron's voice was rough. "Fred's." He stopped. He couldn't finish. His face went blank in the way it did when he was trying not to fall apart. Harry felt the room narrow. The cracked ceiling seemed to press down toward him. "I thought..." When he touched his scar, expecting pain. There was nothing. No heat. No throb. Just skin. Hermione noticed. Her eyes sharpened with that familiar, relentless intelligence, even through grief. "Your scar. It doesn't hurt," Harry said. He hit me with the killing curse. I saw something. Not..." He shook his head dizzy. "And then I woke up." Aberforth snorted from the corner. "Convenient." Hermione rounded on him. "It's not convenient, it's..." She stopped, forced herself to breathe. It's exactly what Dumbledore said might happen." Harry looked at her. "You knew." Her eyes flicked away. Shame. Raw and sudden. "We guessed. We didn't, Harry. We didn't want it to be true. And then when he..." Her voice broke. "Narcissa said you were dead. Everyone saw it. Everyone believed it. We had to run. They were killing anyone left on their feet." Ron's hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "It was a slaughter," he said, quiet and furious. "Kingsley went down. Professor McGonagall, He swallowed hard. "She lived. Barely. They dragged her away." "Nah. Naya." Harry's stomach turned. McGonagall alive. Dragged away. Neville and Luna taken. Hogwarts a prison. Voldemort victorious. "And Voldemort?" Harry asked, though he already knew the answer. It was in the sound of men drinking out front, in the feel of the air, as if the world itself had been claimed. Hermione's mouth tightened. "He's not hiding anymore. The ministry is his. They're calling it Reform. There are posters in Diagon Alley, blood status laws, Muggleborn registrations, trials. Dementors patrol the streets like they own them." Ron barked a humorless laugh. "They do." Harry stared at his hands, at the thin lines of dirt under his nails. He felt strangely hollow. The panic he'd expected, some heroic fire, some roar of resistance, did not come. What came instead was a cold, clean understanding. They had lost. Hermione seemed to read something in his face and stepped closer, voice urgent. "Harry, listen to me. The fact that you lived..." "I didn't win," Harry said. Ginny's fingers tightened painfully. "No, but you're here." Harry looked at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, furious with grief, and still somehow burning. "I'm here?" he echoed, and the words tasted wrong. Being alive didn't feel like victory. It felt like being left behind. Aberforth cleared his throat. If you're done staring at each other like a blasted painting, you should know this. You staying dead is the smartest thing you've ever done. Hermione flinched, but she didn't argue. Harry felt the weight of that sentence settle on his chest. Staying dead. Let the world believe he'd been finished, boxed up, buried. Because if Voldemort discovered the truth, if the Dark Lord realized Harry Potter still breathed, then the war wouldn't be over. It would begin again, but this time with Voldemort seated on a throne. Harry closed his eyes. In the darkness he saw green light, and then white, and then that broken thing curled and dying. He remembered the sensation of being emptied. Something inside him was gone. And something else, something stubborn and quiet, remained. They kept Harry in the back room for a week, because his strength came back in reluctant increments. He could stand, then walk, then climb the narrow stairs to the attic where Aberforth had stuffed an old trunk of clothes and told him to choose something that made him look like no one. Hermione worked quietly, carving the sharpest parts of herself into a plan. Ron watched the door as if he could glare trouble into surrender. Ginny moved restlessly, pacing like a caged thing, her temper a constant warmth in the cold room. Harry listened more than he spoke. Every time he tried to talk about the battle, his mind skittered away from the memory like a hand recoiling from heat. It wasn't just pain. It was unreality. He had watched Voldemort's spell strike him, and he had died, or something close enough that the difference felt like a technicality. He had seen the piece of darkness inside him wither. Now the scar was only a scar. He could look at Voldemort's name in Hermione's notes and feel nothing in his forehead at all. The connection was severed. He had never realized how much he had relied on that sick, unwanted thread. It had been poison, but it had been information. Now there was silence where Voldemort's thoughts used to press. When they finally took him out of the Hog's Head, they did it in the early morning, under a soft gray sky. Aberforth grunted a final warning. Don't do anything stupid. Hermione promised they wouldn't. Ginny didn't promise anything. Harry wore a shabby coat that smelled faintly of old ale. Hermione had darkened his hair with a charm and blurred the shape of his glasses until they looked like cheap Muggle frames. He kept his head down. He did not wear the invisibility cloak. That felt too much like being himself. Diagon Alley had changed in a way that made Harry's stomach twist. It was still the same crooked street, still lined with familiar shopfronts, but the warmth was gone. Signs hung askew, not from age, but from neglect. Windows were boarded. A new banner drooped from Gringotts' white steps. Black cloth with a silver symbol that looked like a skull simplified into a stamp. 2 Aurors stood at the entrance with their wands out, not guarding so much as threatening. The crowd moved like cattle. A line formed outside a newly erected desk that hadn't been there before, the wood raw and pale against the old stone. Behind it sat a witch with ink-stained fingers and an expression of bored cruelty. On the wall behind her was a list of names pinned like a wanted poster. Harry's eyes flicked over it without meaning to. Muggleborn registration. Verification required. Failure to comply. Hermione's breath hitched, so quiet Harry barely heard it. Her shoulders went stiff beneath her cloak. Ron's hand slid to her elbow, steadying her. "Don't," Harry murmured, barely moving his lips. Hermione's voice came through clenched teeth. "I'm fine." A Dementor drifted past the line, not even looking at the people, just existing. A hole in the world. The air chilled. A child began to cry. His mother pulled him close and whispered something frantic in his ear, rocking him with desperate speed. The Dementor glided on, indifferent, leaving a wake of despair. Harry's stomach lurched. He tasted again the bitterness of grief, the empty ache the Dementors had always drawn out of him. But this was different now. The despair wasn't his alone. It soaked the stones. It clung to the alley like fog. They moved, blending into the flow. Passing shops Harry had once treated like wonders. Flourish and Blot's windows were filled with pamphlets in harsh lettering, purity and power. Magic is blood. A display stand held a stack of thin books, all the same title, as if repetition could make a lie into law. They slipped into Nocturne Alley, where the shadows were deeper, and the air smelled of old spells. Here, too, the occupation had reached. A pair of men in dark cloaks stood at the corner, one of them smoking as if this were merely a dull post. They watched every passerby with the lazy attention of predators who knew there was nowhere for prey to run. Hermione's fingers found Harry's sleeve. A tug. She angled him toward a narrow door with a cracked sign. The shop was empty except for dusty shelves and a nervous old wizard behind the counter. He looked up as they entered, his eyes flicking to Hermione's hood, and then away as if looking too long might condemn him. Hermione slid a coin onto the counter. "We need parchment," she said, voice altered. "Lower, flatter. And ink, and—" She hesitated, then forced the word out. "Passage." The old wizard swallowed. His eyes darted to the window. "I don't do that anymore." Ron leaned closer, his voice quiet and dangerous. "You do now." Harry watched the old man's hands shake as he reached under the counter. He pulled out a roll of parchment and a small vial of black ink. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, he produced a thin slip of paper with an address scrawled in cramped writing. "Down by the river," he whispered. "Old warehouse. Midnight." Hermione's fingers closed around the slip. "Thank you." The old wizard flinched at the gratitude like it hurt. "Don't come back," he murmured. They left with the weight of that paper in Hermione's pocket, and the weight of the new world pressing in around them. Harry kept his head down as they moved back into Diagon Alley. He passed a poster on a wall, Voldemort's symbol stamped in ink, and beneath it, a decree in neat, official handwriting. "The war has ended. Peace has returned. Order is restored." Harry looked at the hunched shoulders of the people shuffling past, at the Dementor hovering like a threat, at the Auror's wands and the banners and the boarded windows. Peace, he thought, is what they call a cage when they've built it properly. The warehouse smelled of rot and river mud, a place abandoned by commerce and then reclaimed by secrecy. Fog curled around the broken windows, creeping in as if curious. Their footsteps echoed too loudly on the warped boards. Hermione kept the parchment close to her chest. Ron's fingers worried the edge of an Auror badge he'd lifted earlier with a skill Harry hadn't known he possessed. Ginny's wand was out, her posture tense, ready to strike at anything that breathed wrong. Harry stayed back, half in shadow, because even with his hair darkened and his glasses changed, he could not stop imagining that the air itself might recognize him. He hated that. He hated how fear could make him feel small again. A soft pop sounded behind them, sharp as a snapped twig. Ron whirled, wand raised. Hermione inhaled sharply. Ginny's stance dropped lower, balanced. A house elf stood there, thin as a stick, wearing a ragged pillowcase tied with string. Its enormous eyes reflected the lantern's light, wet and frightened. It held out its hands, palms up, empty, as if showing it carried no weapon. "Harry Potter," the elf whispered, the name reverent and terrified in equal measure. Harry's stomach tightened. The elf's voice felt like a spotlight. Hermione stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" The elf's ears twitched. "Mippa," it said. Mippa is belonging to no one now. Mistress is gone. Master is gone. Mippa is hiding." Harry understood in a flash because war did not only break families, it broke bonds. House elves tethered to homes that had been burned, to masters who had died, to orders that had become meaningless. Ron lowered his wand a fraction. "Why are you here?" Mippa's eyes flicked toward the fog outside the warehouse. "Bad Wizards is taking people," it whispered. "Putting them in wagons, taking them to the big building with the gold doors. Mippa is hearing the crying. Mippa is hearing the shouting. Mippa is knowing the ways." Hermione's face went very still. "The Ministry." Mippa nodded hard, ears flapping. "Mippa can take." It swallowed, its throat working. Mippa can take you in. Mippa can take you out. But it is being dangerous. Mippa is maybe dying. Ginny's mouth tightened. You don't have to. The elf stared at her as if the idea of choice was a language it did not speak. Then it looked back at Harry, and Harry felt unexpectedly something like shame. Because here was a creature smaller than him, more vulnerable, and it was offering itself like a bridge. Hermione's voice softened. How did you find us? Mippa hesitated, then whispered. Narcissa is telling. Narcissa is sending Mippa with message. He's breathing, Narcissa is saying. He is needing help. Harry's heart lurched. Narcissa dot. He remembered her hand on his cheek. Her whisper. Is Draco alive? She saved me. Harry breathed, and the sentence felt like swallowing a stone. Ron's eyebrows shot up. Malfoy's mum? Hermione's eyes sharpened. Why? Mippa's gaze dropped. Narcissa is fearing. Narcissa is knowing if Harry Potter is living, then Voldemort is not being done. Narcissa is wanting Draco safe. Narcissa is... The elf struggled for words. Narcissa is wanting to hold the world still. Harry let out a slow breath. He could almost understand that. Wanting to freeze time at the edge of disaster, to keep the blade from falling. Hermione looked down at the parchment in her hands. Then, up at the elf. You said wagons, how many? Mippa's voice shook. La... Tari... Gun... Two... Gara... Ron swore under his breath. Ginny's grip tightened on her wand. Harry stared at the fog beyond the warehouse windows and tried to see through it, as if the river mist could part and reveal the shape of their next move. He felt the same old urge, the one that had driven him into traps and forests and battles. Rise like a tide. Do something now. Burn bright, break through. But the image of Diagon Alley's line and the Dementor gliding past returned to him, heavy and sickening. These people weren't soldiers. They were being processed, counted, filed. If they ran at the Ministry like a battering ram, they would die. And Voldemort would barely notice the dent. Hermione was watching him, waiting. She could always tell when his mind was turning toward reckless heroics. Harry swallowed. Not tonight, he said. His voice was rough, but it held. We can't save everyone in one swing. Ginny's eyes flashed. So we do nothing? Harry shook his head. We do something that matters. Ron's jaw clenched. What? Harry looked at Hermione, because Hermione was the only one who could hear an unfinished thought and build it into a weapon. We make them doubt, he said quietly. We make them afraid of something they can't arrest. Hermione's brow furrowed. Harry! He won, Harry said. The words tasted bitter, but he forced them out, because pretending otherwise would poison them. He won the war. So we don't fight the war anymore. We fight the story. Mao. Mippa's huge eyes stared at him, unblinking, as if it didn't understand but desperately wanted to. Harry's mind returned to Voldemort's face in the Great Hall, still, calm, satisfied. A ruler at last. Voldemort wanted permanence, legitimacy. A world that said his name with obedience, not defiance. And Voldemort believed Harry Potter was dead. Harry's hands curled into fists. If he can be wrong about that, Harry whispered, then he can be wrong about other things. Outside, the river moved in the fog like a dark vein, carrying secrets toward the sea. Mippa brought them into the Ministry through a place that smelled like damp stone and old magic. A narrow service corridor behind a wall that had no business opening. A seam in the world only house elves seemed to find. Harry's skin prickled as they stepped through. The air felt thick with wards, layered like frost. They went in with disguises and lies, because it was the only way to breathe in a world that belonged to Voldemort. Hermione had altered her face with careful magic, softening her features, darkening her eyebrows, making her look older and plainer. Ron wore an Auror uniform that fit badly, its shoulders too sharp on him, as if the clothes resisted being worn by someone who still had a conscience. Ginny was not with them. The risk of 3 was enough, and she had a different job tonight, watching the river, guarding the escape. Harry wore the invisibility cloak. Pulling it over his head felt like stepping into an old habit. It smelled faintly of dust and pine, like the inside of a trunk. It made him invisible, but it did not make him less present. He could still feel the Ministry's oppression pressing against his skin, the way a storm presses before lightning strikes. The Atrium was unrecognizable. The bright fountain had been stripped. In its place stood a new statue, a witch and wizard carved in pale stone, seated on a throne of human forms, their feet resting on the bent backs of smaller figures that were unmistakably meant to be Muggles and Muggleborns. The sculpture wasn't subtle. It was ideology made permanent. People moved beneath it quickly, eyes down. The sound of footsteps echoed off the polished floor, but there was no conversation, only the low rustle of papers and the occasional sharp bark of an order. Harry followed Hermione and Ron through the crowd like a ghost. He watched the way the Ministry workers flinched when a black-cloaked figure passed. He watched the way chains clinked somewhere to the right, and tried not to think about who wore them. They reached a long table set up beneath the statue, and Harry's stomach tightened because the woman behind it wore pink. Dolores Umbridge's smile was the most horrifying thing in the room, because it was pleased. She stamped papers with meticulous satisfaction, her short fingers moving as if she were doing needlework rather than condemning lives. Hermione lowered her head as she approached, mimicking the posture of a subordinate. Ron stood stiffly beside her, his face blank. Umbridge's eyes flicked up. "Name?" she purred. Hermione slid a folder forward. "Eloise Midgen," she said smoothly, voice altered. Umbridge's quill scratched. "Blood status?" Hermione's hand trembled once, almost imperceptible. Harry felt it like an echo in his own nerves. "Verified," Hermione said, and the lie tasted like ashes in Harry's mouth even though he didn't speak it. Umbridge stamped the folder. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "A finality." "Next," she said. To the side, a line of people stood in chains, wrists bound, their clothes rumpled as if they'd been dragged from beds. A young wizard stared straight ahead with glassy eyes. A witch with graying hair whispered a prayer under her breath. An Auror in black watched them, bored. Harry wanted to reach out and tear the chains apart with his bare hands. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hex Umbridge until she couldn't smile again. He did none of those things, because Hermione's plan relied on the sickening truth that if Harry revealed himself here, the Ministry would become his tomb. Voldemort would not come personally, not for prisoners and paperwork. He would send men. He would send Dementors. He would send the full weight of the state he had built. Harry needed something else from this place. They moved on, passing through corridors that narrowed, down stairs that smelled of mildew and secrets. Mippa guided them with silent pops and nervous glances, slipping between walls like a heartbeat. They reached a filing room, rows of shelves, boxes labeled in neat handwriting. Hermione's eyes scanned quickly, zeroing in. "This," she whispered, pulling a folder free. Her fingers moved fast, flipping pages. Names, addresses, blood status. Harry leaned closer, the cloak brushing Hermione's shoulder. He could see the ink, lists and lists of people, as if human lives were problems to be solved with bureaucracy. Ron's voice was a rasp. "How many?" Hermione swallowed. "Thousands." Harry felt his lungs tighten. "Thousands. Registered. Marked. Waiting." Hermione began copying pages with rapid spells, the parchment duplicating itself into a neat stack. Ron stood guard at the door, his wand hidden in his sleeve. Harry listened to the distant sounds of the Ministry, a cough, footsteps, a muffled sob, and tried to turn his anger into something sharp and usable. When Hermione finished, she slid the copies into her bag. Her eyes met Harry's through the slight shimmer of the cloak. Even now, even here, she was thinking ahead. "We can't undo it," her gaze said. "Not yet." Harry nodded once because he understood. To dismantle a machine, you didn't throw yourself into its gears. You jammed it where it couldn't move, and you made everyone see it was only metal and fear. As they slipped back toward the service corridor, Harry glanced once more at the statue in the atrium. The stone wizard's foot rested on a carved human spine. Voldemort had won the war. Now he was sculpting the world to match his victory. Harry tightened his grip on the edge of the cloak and promised himself, silently, that the sculpture would not stand forever. They didn't go back to the Hogshead. It was too obvious, too central, a place Voldemort's people would eventually decide to cleanse simply because it had always been inconvenient. Instead, Mippa led them to an attic above a shuttered apothecary on the edge of Muggle London, where the air smelled of dust and dried herbs, and the roof leaked in slow, steady drips that sounded like time counting itself down. Hermione spread the copied pages across the table. Names stared up at them in black ink. People Harry didn't know. People Hermione might have met once in a library. People Ron would have passed in Diagon Alley without thinking. Each name was a person who now belonged to a list. Ron paced until the floorboards creaked in protest. "So what do we do?" he demanded. "Send them letters? Walk in and what?" Ginny snapped, turning from the window. Rainwater traced thin lines down the glass. "Die heroically? That won't save them." Ron's hands clenched. "At least it'd be something." Hermione's voice was quiet. "It would be what Voldemort expects." Silence fell. Even Ron couldn't argue with that, not when the truth sat there like a wound. Harry stood at the table and looked at the names until they blurred. He could feel the old pressure in his chest, the familiar pull towards sacrifice. It had shaped his life. It had been praised. It had been demanded. But now, after death and returning, sacrifice felt different. It felt less like destiny and more like habit. A pattern Voldemort could predict. "Voldemort wants a martyr," Harry said softly. "Or a corpse. Either works for him." "No need." Hermione's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't give him one." Ron stopped pacing. He stared at Harry like he was trying to see if this was a trick. "What are you saying?" Harry didn't have the whole thought yet. He had only fragments, sharp edges, things he'd noticed. The bored efficiency of the Ministry's cruelty, the way the Dementor glided like a symbol of inevitability, the way Narcissa had lied because she wanted the war to be over for her family. He looked at the cloak, draped over his arm. Invisibility. Not absence, just the ability to choose when you were seen. "We make him chase smoke," Harry said. "We make him spend his power proving he has it." Hermione's eyes narrowed. "A distraction." "A crack," Harry corrected. "People obey because they think he can do anything, because they think he's inevitable." Ginny's gaze sharpened. "You want to show them he isn't." Ron let out a shaky breath. "By doing what? Walking into the Ministry and waving?" Harry's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it died quickly. "Not waving." Hermione leaned forward, the lantern light catching in her eyes. "If Voldemort believes you're dead," she said slowly, "then his victory depends on that belief. His legitimacy." Harry nodded. "He's building a government. He wants it to last. He wants people to stop thinking of him as the end of the world and start thinking of him as the world." Ron grimaced. "That's disgusting." "Exactly," Hermione said. "It means he has something to lose." Mippa shifted by the door, huge eyes watching them as if they were speaking spells. Ginny crossed the room and leaned over the table, her finger tracing a line of addresses. "We start small," she said, voice tight, repeating Harry's words back to him. "We pull people out of the lists before they're used. We make mistakes expensive for them." Hermione looked up. "And the story?" Harry felt his heartbeat steady. "The story comes when we're ready to survive it." Ron frowned. "That doesn't answer." "It does," Ginny cut in, suddenly understanding. Her eyes locked on Harry's. "You mean you're not going to show yourself until it matters enough?" Harry nodded once. Hermione's gaze softened, just a fraction. "You're learning," she whispered. as if she wasn't sure whether to be proud or afraid. Harry wasn't sure either. Outside, rain fell harder, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. The world beyond their attic continued to turn under Voldemort's rule, people being registered and chained and renamed. Harry stared at the map until his eyes began to ache. Voldemort had built a throne out of fear. Harry intended, slowly and deliberately, to steal the nails. Hogwarts did not close. It became something else. The first messages came through whispers and old magic, carried by hands that didn't want to be seen. A page torn from a library book slipped under the attic door. A matchbox left on the windowsill with a single coin inside, scratched with a symbol Hermione recognized. A house elf pop in the night, leaving a crumpled note and vanishing before anyone could ask where it had come from. The school was open. Attendance was mandatory. Education, the ministry called it. Unity, stability. What it was, Hermione said, was hostages. Neville's name appeared first in a report that Ron stole from an Auror drunk enough to brag. Hogwarts, discipline reinforced. Resistant students managed. Key agitator contained. Harry read the words and saw Neville's face in his mind. Stubborn, earnest, with courage that always looked like disbelief. Key agitator, as if bravery were a disease. Luna's name appeared later, in a list of reassigned labor. Harry felt a flash of guilt, sharp and hot, because Luna had already been a prisoner once, and he had promised himself she never would be again. Ginny took the news with a quiet rage that made her hands shake. Hermione took it with a cold focus. She began drawing diagrams of Hogwarts' old wards, the ones Dumbledore had woven through stone and iron. She spoke of secret passages, of how the Carrows might have disabled certain protections, of which portraits could still be trusted. She spoke as if Hogwarts were a fortress to be mapped, because that was how Hermione survived fear, by turning it into a problem she could solve. They couldn't go to the castle. Not yet. Not with Voldemort's people there. Not with a net tightened around the school like wire. But they could reach in with threads. Hermione dug out an old DA coin from her bag, her fingers lingering on it. For a moment, her face softened with memory. Students in a hidden room, laughter, spells practiced in secret. Then she pressed her thumb to the edge and whispered a charm. The coin warmed in her palm. Hours passed. The attic's air grew stale with waiting. Ron paced. Ginny sat rigid at the window, watching the street below as if expecting Death Eaters to appear from the rain. Harry held his breath in a way he didn't realize he was doing. At last, the coin's surface shifted. Tiny letters formed, like a message written in heat. Alive. Watching. Hermione let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for weeks. Luna? She whispered. Ron leaned over her shoulder. Only that? Hermione's eyes darted, reading the short words like scripture. Alive. Watching. It means she can see. She can send information. Ginny's jaw clenched. It means she's in there. Harry's chest tightened. Hogwarts. The place that had been home. Now a cage. Neville scrubbing steps under watch. Luna carrying buckets, her dreamy gaze forced down by cruelty. Harry thought of the Great Hall, the banners, the torches. Voldemort's calm. He thought of Voldemort building a world that required children to learn obedience, as if it were a subject. He looked at Hermione. Can we send a message back? Hermione nodded, already turning the coin, already preparing words. Sure, if we make it too long. Harry swallowed. Tell her to stay alive, he said. The sentence felt painfully insufficient. Tell her, we'll come. Hermione's quill hovered, then wrote on a scrap of paper as if she could pour more meaning into the letters through sheer will. She charmed the coin again, and the surface warmed beneath her thumb. Stay alive. We're here. Harry stared at the tiny words as if they were a rope thrown across an abyss. When the coin cooled, the attic seemed colder too. The distance between them and Hogwarts stretched in Harry's mind until it felt impossible. Yet that little warmth, That tiny shifting message proved the distance could be crossed. Ginny's voice was quiet. If we get Neville and Luna out? Hermione's eyes flicked up. We can't just get them out. Hogwarts is full of students, Ginny. Full of children who'll be punished for the act of someone else escaping. Ron swore softly, because even his anger had learned to count costs. Harry sat back on a crate, the wood biting into his palms. He stared at the cloak, folded like a sleeping animal in the corner. He stared at the copied lists from the ministry. He stared at the coin in Hermione's hand. He thought of the story he had promised to fight. How do you tell a story in a world where children are punished for reading? How do you start a rebellion when rebellion means someone else's pain? Harry closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, the broken thing in the white void twitched once more and went still. Something had ended inside him the night Voldemort won. Now something else had to begin. News traveled in Voldemort's Britain the way it always had, not through truth, but through fear. It took them a month to understand the shape of the new court. It wasn't just Death Eaters swaggering through Diagon Alley. It was meetings and decrees, appointments and celebrations. Voldemort wanted to be seen, but not in the way he had been seen before, as a nightmare glimpsed at the edge of a dark mark. He wanted, Hermione said with disgust, to be ordinary in his authority. So he held dinners. Harry learned this through Mippa, who listened in places humans forgot existed. House elves drifted through walls and under tables. They heard the low murmur of pure blood names, the clink of glasses, the satisfactions of people congratulating themselves for surviving on the right side. Malfoy Manor had become a court again, filled with the smell of roast meat and old money and dread. Voldemort is like in the long table, Mippa whispered one night in the attic. Voldemort is sitting at the end like kings in stories. Ginny's mouth twisted. Ugh. Of course he is. Hermione's eyes were sharp, extracting information like it was potion ingredients. Who's there? Mippa's ears twitched. Narcissa, Draco, Bellatrix, Lucius, many others. The snake is always there. Voldemort is touching the snake like it is. The elf struggled. Like it is precious. Harry felt a chill slide down his spine at the mention of the snake. Nagini. Voldemort's familiar. Voldemort's pet. Hermione looked up from her papers. He keeps it close? Mippa nodded hard, ears flapping. Always. Always. Hermione's gaze met Harry's. The same thought flared between them, unspoken but heavy. Horcrux. They had destroyed the others, most of them at least. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup. Hermione had seen the cup's destruction with her own eyes, watched it crack and scream with a sound that made her vomit afterward. The diadem, they weren't sure. In the chaos of the battle, the room of requirement had burned and collapsed, but nobody could say for certain what had happened inside. Harry had been the seventh, the hidden fragment no one wanted to name aloud. Now the scar was silent. The empty space inside him felt like proof. If Nagini was the last, then Voldemort's immortality was reduced to something that could bleed. Harry's throat went dry. The idea of killing a snake felt almost absurd in the shadow of everything else. Yet so much of their war had been absurd. Basilisks, cursed lockets, a piece of soul hiding in a boy's chest. Ron blew out a breath. "We kill the snake," he said, like he was daring the universe to argue. Hermione's voice was tight. "If we can. But Voldemort knows it's precious. He will guard it better than he guards his own followers." Ginny's eyes narrowed. "So we don't go for the snake." Ron stared at her. "It's his Horcrux. It's his weakness," Ginny corrected. "Which means it's protected. Which means it's a trap." Hermione tapped her quill against the table. "Ginny's right. Voldemort learned from the last war. He won't leave it in a vault. He won't hide it in a cave. He keeps it with him because he thinks proximity is control." Harry's mind flicked back to Voldemort's face in the Great Hall, calm, satisfied. He had looked like a man who finally trusted his own victory. A man who might make mistakes because he believed he had stopped needing to be careful. Harry stared at the map Hermione had drawn of Malfoy Manor from memory and old records. The rooms, the corridors, the gardens. "How do we get close enough?" Ron asked, voice rough. Hermione's eyes went distant, thinking. "We don't," she said finally. "Not yet." Ron's hand slammed on the table. "So we wait while people get chained." Hermione flinched, but her voice didn't waver. "We move people out. We undermine the Ministry. We bleed them in places they don't expect. We build networks that survive even if—" She stopped, swallowed. "Even if we don't." The unfinished sentence hung in the attic like smoke. Harry reached across the table and took Hermione's hand briefly, squeezing once. It was a small touch. A promise. Hermione's fingers squeezed back, hard. Ginny's voice cut through the silence, quiet and fierce. "You said we fight the story," she reminded Harry. "So what's the story?" Harry's mouth felt dry. He stared at the map, at the name Malfoy Manor written in Hermione's careful handwriting. He imagined Voldemort at the head of that table, the snake coiled near him like a crown. "Voldemort wants people to believe he's finished the war," Harry said slowly. "That he's untouchable. That the world is settled." "Nani? Nai," Ron snorted. "Settled into hell." Harry nodded. "Then we make the world unsettled." Hermione's gaze sharpened. "How?" Harry's mind reached for something he had never wanted to be. A symbol. A story. A rumor that could walk through walls where wands could not. He thought of Narcissa's lie. He thought of the poster in Diagon Alley. "Peace has returned." He looked at Hermione. "We let the whisper start," he said. "We let it spread until even Voldemort hears it." Ron frowned. "What whisper?" Harry's voice was very quiet. "That I'm alive." The attic fell silent. Even the rain seemed to pause, listening. Hermione stared at him as if seeing the shape of a weapon she hadn't known existed. Ginny's expression sharpened into something almost like excitement, grim and bright. Ron's face went pale. "That'll bring him down on us," Ron said hoarse. "Yes," Harry agreed. "That's the point. They chose a rooftop because stories needed air." London at night under Voldemort's rule felt like a city holding its breath. The Muggle streets below still had traffic, still had lamplight, and the ordinary hum of people living lives the magical world had decided didn't matter. But above it, in the invisible layer of wizarding fear, you could feel the Dementors like a pressure change, drifting along unseen currents. Hermione had found the place, an abandoned building near the river with a roof flat enough to stand on and high enough to be seen by those who knew where to look. There were wards nearby, ministry wards, the kind that hummed faintly in the bones. Hermione said it was perfect. "Because they'll feel it," she explained, rain streaking down her face. "They'll notice something big." Ron looked dubious. "Something big tends to get you killed." Ginny rolled the small glass orb between her palms. Inside it, like pulsed, trapped and eager. "That's why it's big," she said. Harry stood at the roof's edge and stared out over the city. He could see nothing magical. No banners. No dark marks floating above buildings. The occupation had learned to hide from Muggle eyes. It was quieter than the First War, but not kinder. It was paperwork and patrols, arrests in alleys, disappearances explained away. He pulled the invisibility cloak back from his head. Rain cooled his hair instantly. The night wind slapped at his face, sharp and clean. Hermione stood beside him, wand in hand. Her posture was rigid, as if she were holding herself upright with will alone. "Once we do this," she said softly, "we can't take it back." Harry nodded. "I know." Ron shifted, watching the street below. "And if he comes—" "He won't come here," Hermione said, voice tight. "Not immediately. He'll send people. He'll tighten nets. He'll make examples. But it'll also make him react." Harry looked at her. "That's what we want." Ginny's eyes gleamed. "We want him angry." Hermione swallowed. We want him uncertain. Harry took a breath that tasted of rain and chimney smoke. He felt his heartbeat steady. The rooftop was slick under his boots. The edge dropped away into darkness and distance. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff again, but this time he was not stepping off. He was planting his feet. "Do it," he said. Ginny held up the glass orb. It was a small thing, delicate, but it pulsed with contained magic. "A memory," Hermione said, distilled and sharpened. A message that could travel further than a voice. Hermione lifted her wand. Her mouth tightened as if bracing against pain. "Expecto Patronum," she whispered. Silver light erupted from the wand, brilliant against the dark. For a moment it was only a swirl, a storm of luminous threads. Then it took shape. Antlers, legs, a proud head lifted to the wind. A stag, radiant and defiant, standing in the rain as if rain could not touch it. Harry's breath caught. He had not seen his Patronus since before the battle, before Voldemort's victory. The sight of it now felt like seeing a part of himself he'd assumed was gone. The stag stepped forward, hooves leaving no mark on the wet roof, and leapt into the night. It soared above the city, silver and unmistakable. A living heraldic beast that demanded attention from anyone with magic in their blood. Harry watched it go with a strange mix of pride and dread. He imagined it streaking over the river, over the hidden wards, over the ministry itself. Hermione's voice shook as she spoke into the Patronus. The words carried inside the silver light like a secret wrapped in steel. "He didn't kill me," Hermione said. "He never did." Harry flinched. That wasn't what they'd rehearsed. He turned to Hermione, startled. Hermione's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "It's true," she whispered fiercely. "Let the truth be the weapon." The stag paused in the air above them, as if listening, then bolted forward again, carrying the sentence into the night. Ron stared up, face pale. "That's bloody hell, Hermione." Ginny let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sob. "That'll do it." Harry's throat tightened. He stepped closer to Hermione, rain running down his face. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with an intensity that frightened him. Hermione's mouth trembled. "Don't die," she whispered back, and it was not an order. It was a plea. They watched the Patronus vanish into the distance. For a long moment, nothing happened. The city below continued to move. The rain continued to fall. The world did not crack open. Then, faintly, Harry felt it. The ministry wards humming, shifting, reacting like a living thing startled awake. A ripple through the air. Subtle but unmistakable. Somewhere far away, a spell alarm would flare. Somewhere, an auror would look up. And somewhere, in a place of dark wood and candlelight, Voldemort would hear a whisper he could not ignore. Harry pulled the cloak over his head again, disappearing into the rain, and felt the strange, terrifying thrill of having done something that could not be undone. The story had begun. The backlash came first as silence. No immediate raid. No pounding on the attic door. No Death Eater silhouettes in the streetlight. Hermione kept expecting it, flinching at every creak of the building. Ron slept with his wand in his hand. Ginny paced so much she wore a groove into the floor. Harry felt the weighting like a noose. Then the consequences began to arrive in pieces, carried by the same channels they used to survive. Diagon Alley tightened. More patrols. More Dementors. Shops forced to close for inspection. A curfew announced with cheerful posters and enforced with fear. The ministry issued a statement. Hermione stole a copy off a notice board that declared unauthorized Patronus messaging an act of sedition. "Like it's a newsletter," Ron muttered, crumpling it. Hermione's eyes were sharp. "They're trying to make it mundane," she said. "Trying to drag it down into paperwork." But there was an edge to the statement that made Harry's skin prickle. A fury concealed beneath bureaucratic wording, like a knife wrapped in cloth. Voldemort had heard. Mippa confirmed it the next night. appearing in the attic with ears trembling and eyes huge. "Voldemort is angry," the elf whispered, voice shaking. "Voldemort is breaking glasses. Voldemort—" It swallowed. "Voldemort is asking questions." Harry's stomach tightened. "What kind of questions?" Mippa's gaze flicked toward the door as if expecting it to open. "Voldemort is asking if Harry Potter is living. Voldemort is asking who is hearing. Voldemort is asking who is lying." Hermione's face went white. "Narcissa." Mippa nodded miserably. "Narcissa is being questioned. Draco is being questioned. Many is being questioned. Voldemort is looking inside heads. Legitimacy." Harry felt a cold dread settle in his chest, because he knew how Voldemort's mind felt when it pressed against yours. Not a voice but a force. A presence that made you doubt your own thoughts. Ron's voice was hoarse. "We did this." "Yes," Harry said. His voice didn't shake. "We did." Ginny's eyes were bright, almost feverish. "Good." Hermione turned on her. "Ginny, people will die because of this." Ginny's jaw clenched. "People are already dying," she shot back. "At least now he's scared." Hermione flinched, because the word scared felt like blasphemy when applied to Voldemort. But it was also the point. Harry sat down hard on a crate, the wood digging into his thighs. He closed his eyes and tried to picture Voldemort's reaction. Not the theatrical rage of a villain, but the private fury of a ruler whose authority had been challenged. Voldemort had built a world where his victory was unquestioned. Harry had planted doubt. And Voldemort, for all his power, could not tolerate doubt. Not because it threatened his life, but because it threatened his meaning. In the days that followed, they saw the first executions. Not public at first. Quiet disappearances. Bodies found in alleys with dark marks burned into their skin as warnings. Then, a week later, a public hanging of a wizard accused of spreading rumors. Hermione read the ministry announcement aloud, voice flat. "Convicted of treason, dissemination of false information, undermining public order." Ron punched the wall so hard the plaster cracked. Ginny swore with a viciousness that made Harry's stomach clench. Harry stared at the paper until the words blurred. He had wanted Voldemort to react. He had wanted the net to tighten, because a tightened net could be cut. But he hadn't wanted. He forced himself to stop. Wanting had nothing to do with it. This was the cost of fighting a story with blood. Hermione sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "We can't undo it," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "So we have to make it worth it." Harry swallowed, throat tight. "How many will die before it's worth it?" Hermione didn't answer. Her silence was the only honest thing she could give. That night, Harry lay on the attic floor and stared at the roof beams. Rain dripped steadily into a bucket. Each drop sounded like a second. He thought of Narcissa, fingers trembling on his throat. He thought of Draco's pale face in the Great Hall. He thought of Voldemort pushing into minds, punishing lies. Harry's scar stayed silent. No warning. No pain. He was blind in a way he had never been before. And yet, in the silence, he heard something else. The faint crackle of fear in the air, not his own, but Voldemort's court, Voldemort's followers, Voldemort's world. A rumor could be hunted. A rumor could be crushed. But a rumor could also spread faster than a spell. Harry closed his eyes and made himself a promise. If Voldemort was going to spill blood to stamp out the whisper, then Harry would make sure the whisper became a roar. The idea of speaking to Draco Malfoy tasted like rust. It was Hermione's plan, which meant it had been thought through in ways Harry instinctively avoided. Draco was close to Voldemort. Draco was not loyal out of love, but out of fear. Draco had a mother who had lied to Voldemort's face. "Narcissa is a seam," Hermione said, tapping her quill against the map of Malfoy Manor. "And Draco is attached to her, if we can pull on him." Ron's face twisted. "He'll sell us out." "He might," Hermione agreed. but he might also do anything to keep Voldemort from looking inside his mother's head again. Harry had sat silent while they argued, watching the way Ron's anger flared and Hermione's logic held. Ginny, unusually, had been quiet. When Harry looked at her, her expression was hard to read. "He's a coward," Ginny said finally, voice flat. "But cowards can be useful." So they went to the Ministry again, because Draco moved there now, a reluctant envoy of the Malfoy name. Voldemort's government liked old families. It liked the appearance of continuity. Draco was a thin veneer over a new cruelty. Hermione and Ron took their disguises. Harry took the cloak. The service corridor felt colder this time, as if the Ministry itself had grown suspicious. They found Draco in a narrow corridor near the old Department of Mysteries, where the air smelled faintly of dust and secrecy. He stood alone, staring at a door that had been sealed with heavy wards. His shoulders were hunched. He looked thinner than Harry remembered, his blonde hair longer, untidy. He did not look like someone who had won. Harry waited until Hermione and Ron were positioned at the far end of the corridor, hidden behind an alcove. Then he let the cloak slip back just enough to reveal his face. Draco's head snapped up. For a heartbeat, Draco's expression was blank, as if his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Then his face drained of color. "You," Draco breathed. Harry stepped forward slowly, hands visible, wand held low. He did not want Draco to flinch into panic and shout. He did not want Draco to run. Draco's eyes darted to the shadows behind Harry, as if expecting an ambush. His breathing quickened. "You're dead." "So they said," Harry replied. Draco's throat worked. "How?" "My question," Harry interrupted, voice quiet and firm, "is why your mother lied." Draco's jaw clenched. His hands trembled. "To," he swallowed. "To stop him. To stop it. She wanted it to be over." Harry watched Draco's face, trying to read the shape of his fear. Draco had always been good at hiding behind arrogance. Now there was no arrogance left, only dread. "He questioned her," Harry said. Draco's eyes flicked away. "Yes." "How?" Draco's laugh was sharp and broken. "How do you think?" He glanced toward the corridor's end, as if expecting Voldemort to appear. He looks. Inside, he doesn't care if it hurts. He doesn't care if it breaks you. He wants the truth the way he wants everything, without asking. Harry felt cold settle in his stomach. Draco's voice dropped. "He thinks people are lying to him. He thinks..." Draco's breath hitched. "He thinks you're alive." Harry held Draco's gaze. "I am." Draco's hands tightened into fists. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," Harry said, and he did not look away. "That's why I'm here. I need to know what he's doing." Draco stared at him for a long moment. The corridor's torchlight flickered, throwing shadows under his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was raw. "He's not like before. He's calmer. He doesn't shout as much. He doesn't." Draco swallowed. "It's worse." Hermione had said something similar. Voldemort, victorious, had shifted. The rage was contained now, focused. Draco's gaze flicked to Harry's wand. "He's obsessed with the Elder Wand," Draco blurted, as if the words had been clawing at his throat. "He thinks it's his, but it doesn't." Draco's hands trembled harder. "It doesn't feel right." Harry's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Draco's eyes were wild. "Sometimes spells hesitate. Sometimes it's like the wand doesn't want to." He broke off, swallowing hard. "He thinks it's because there are traitors, that loyalty is weak. He's hunting for betrayal like it's a disease." Harry felt the pieces click together with a sharp, sudden clarity. The Elder Wand. Loyalty. Ownership. He had taken Draco's wand at Malfoy Manor. He had disarmed Draco, taken control without meaning to. The Elder Wand's allegiance had shifted to Harry then, invisible and undeniable. Voldemort held the wand like a king held a crown, but the crown did not belong to him. Harry stepped closer. Draco flinched, but did not run. "You know where he keeps the snake," Harry said. Draco's lips parted. His eyes flicked toward the sealed door behind him. He swallowed. "He keeps it with him, always. Bah, bah, bah. Bah, what?" Harry pressed. Draco's voice dropped to a whisper. "He trusts it more than us. Which means if he thinks you're alive, if he thinks he failed, he'll keep it closer. He'll never let it out of his sight." "Nay." Hermione's voice echoed in Harry's mind. Proximity is control. Harry's grip tightened on his wand. "Draco," he said quietly, and the use of Draco's first name felt like stepping into dangerous territory. "Your mother saved me, not because she cares about me, because she cares about you." Draco's eyes flashed. Pain and anger tangled. "Don't," he spat, voice shaking. "Don't pretend you understand her." "I don't," Harry admitted. "But I understand this. Voldemort is using you. He used you before. He'll use you again. And when you're no longer useful." Draco's breath hitched. Harry held his gaze. "Help us." Draco stared at him, caught between terror and something else that looked, for a second, like exhaustion. Then he shook his head sharply, like trying to clear water from his ears. "I can't," Draco whispered. "You don't know what he does." Harry's voice was very quiet. "I do." Draco flinched at that, because Harry's tone carried a weight Draco could not argue with. For a moment, the corridor was only torchlight and breathing, and the distant hum of the Ministry's wards. Then Draco's voice came out brittle. "If I tell you something," he said, "you leave. You don't come back. You don't let him." Harry nodded once. Draco swallowed. "There's a ceremony," he whispered. "A public one. He's going to be declared, officially, in the Atrium." Hermione had been right. Voldemort wanted legitimacy. Draco's eyes met Harry's, bright with fear. "If you're going to do something," Draco said, voice cracking, "that's when it matters." Harry let the cloak slide back over his head, disappearing. Draco stared at the space where Harry had been, his breathing ragged. As Harry retreated into shadow, he heard Draco whisper, barely audible, "Please." Harry didn't know if Draco meant "please don't," or "please do," or "please end it." Maybe Draco didn't know either. Harry went to Godric's Hollow because he needed to feel something that wasn't strategy. The village looked smaller than he remembered, as if time had shrunk it. Snow lay in thin patches on the stone walls and bare branches. The air was sharp, clean, unforgiving. The ruins of his parents' cottage still stood behind a ward that had long since faded from protection into memorial. Charred beams jutted up like ribs. Someone had left a wreath there once, years ago. Now it was gone. Even grief had been looted. Hermione walked beside Harry with a lantern, the light warm against the cold dusk. She didn't speak. She didn't offer comfort in words, because Hermione had learned that grief didn't listen to language. Ron and Ginny moved through the trees behind them, keeping watch with grim competence. This was Voldemort's Britain now. Even graves could be traps. Harry stopped in front of the two stones. James Potter, Lily Potter. The names were carved deep, still legible beneath a dusting of snow. Someone had scratched a line through Lily's name, a petty act of hatred that made Harry's throat tighten. Hermione crouched without a word and brushed the snow away with her gloved hand, fingers gentle. Harry stared at the dates, at the end of their lives, at the way the world reduced his parents into clean lines and stone. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words felt absurd. "Sorry was what you said when you bumped someone's shoulder, not when you failed to stop history from repeating itself." Hermione stood and took a slow breath. "Harry," she said softly, He didn't answer. His hand slipped into his pocket and found the small, hard shape of the resurrection stone, hidden in the snitch he carried like a secret wound. He hadn't used it since that other night, in the forest, in a different possible world that now felt like a dream he'd woken from. Even touching it made his chest ache. He thought of the white void, of the broken thing dying, of being held by warmth he couldn't name. He thought of his parents' faces, remembered only in photographs and flashes of magic. He wanted to ask them what to do. He wanted to ask them how to live in a world where Voldemort had won. His fingers closed around the stone. Hermione's eyes sharpened. She saw the motion, the way Harry's shoulders shifted, the tension in his hand. "Harry," she said again, firmer. "Don't. Harry's throat worked. "Why not?" Hermione's voice trembled. "Because it won't give you what you want. It'll—" She swallowed, eyes bright. "It'll hurt you, and you'll start relying on it. And then—" She shook her head. "And then you'll forget how to be here." Harry stared at the gravestones. The snow melted where Hermione's lantern light touched it, tiny beads of water forming and sliding down stone like tears. "I already don't know how," Harry whispered. Hermione stepped closer, lantern held high, her face lit in amber. "You do," she said quietly. "You're doing it. You're here. You're breathing. You're not walking into death because it feels easier than living with the consequences." Harry flinched, because she was right. Death had been simpler. Death had been a decision he could make alone. Living required him to carry other people's pain, to watch the world suffer and not throw himself into the fire just to make the suffering stop for a moment. Ron cleared his throat behind them. "We don't have long," he said, voice low. "I think I heard." Ginny's hand tightened on her wand. Movement. Dotty. Harry forced his fingers open. The stone stayed in his pocket. He didn't take it out. He didn't spin it. He didn't call ghosts into the cold air. Instead, he knelt and pressed his palm against the gravestone's rough surface. The stone was cold enough to sting. "I'm going to fix it," Harry whispered, and the promise felt too big, too arrogant. Fix it. Fix a world. But he didn't mean fix it like a child fixing a broken toy. He meant it like rebuilding a house after a fire, one beam at a time, knowing it would never be the same, knowing the scorch marks would remain. Hermione's lantern flickered in the wind. Ron and Ginny shifted, listening. Somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped. Harry stood, hand leaving the stone. His fingers were numb. He turned away from his parents' graves and walked back toward the darkness of the village, toward the war that wasn't called a war anymore. Behind him, the gravestones remained, silent witnesses. Ahead of him, Voldemort was preparing a ceremony to declare himself the world. Harry pulled his coat tighter around him, the cold biting deep, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something like clarity. He would not be a martyr. He would be a problem Voldemort could not bury. They planned the Atrium like they were planning a siege. Hermione drew runes on stone floors, muttering about ward resonance and spell backlash. Ron stole ministry seals, small, wax-like stamps used to mark documents as official, and grinned grimly when he got them, as if theft were the only kind of satisfaction left. Ginny tested escape routes with a soldier's patience, counting seconds between patrols, memorizing the sound of boots. Harry listened. He watched. He forced himself to be the kind of leader he had never wanted to become. One who did not run first and think later. The ceremony was scheduled for midday, because Voldemort liked daylight now. He liked being seen. He liked the implication that darkness was not his hiding place, but his choice. They learned the details from Draco, whispered through a chain of intermediaries so fragile Hermione insisted they burn every scrap of paper after reading. Voldemort would stand beneath the new statue in the atrium. Pious thickness would speak. The heads of the old pure-blood families would attend, dressed in finery, pretending this was history rather than horror. Dementors would hover at the edges like decorative threats. And Voldemort would be declared the rightful ruler of magical Britain, The war officially ended. The regime sanctified. He wants to be crowned, Ginny said, disgust curling her lip. Hermione's face was pale. He wants to make it real, she replied. Magic responds to belief. Traditions matter. If enough people accept him as legitimate. Ron cut in, harsh. He's murdering people in the streets. How's that legitimate? Hermione's eyes flashed. Legitimacy isn't morality, Ron. It's agreement. It's everyone deciding the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of obeying. Nay. Harry felt his stomach twist. He had seen that agreement in Diagon Alley's bowed heads. He had felt it in the Ministry's quiet corridors. So we break the agreement, Harry said. Hermione nodded, chalk dust on her fingertips. Yes. Ron crossed his arms. How? Harry didn't answer immediately, because the plan sat in his mind like a stone he was turning over, searching for weakness. If he appeared and spoke, Voldemort would try to kill him. If Voldemort failed, truly, visibly failed, then the agreement would crack. But the cost of that crack could be blood. Hermione watched him, reading the conflict in his face. We can minimize casualties, she said quietly. We choose our moment. We keep it brief. We get out. Ginny's eyes were bright and fierce. We make it a humiliation, she said, almost savoring the word. Ron looked at Harry, jaw tight. You sure you can survive it? Harry touched his scar. Still silent. He thought of the white void. The warmth. The sense of being tethered. I don't know, he admitted. But I know this. The Elder Wand isn't his. Draco said it doesn't feel right. If he tries to kill me with it in front of everyone. Hermione's eyes sharpened. It might fail. Harry nodded. And if it does, they'll see. Ron exhaled sharply. That's mad. Ginny's smile was thin. That's perfect. Hermione wiped chalk dust on her cloak. We need a diversion, she said, already moving pieces on the board. We need to get you close enough without triggering every ward in the building. Mippa lifted the string of tiny keys, hands trembling. Mippa can take, the elf whispered. Mippa can take you behind the walls. Hermione nodded, gentle for once. We know, and we'll get you out too. Mippa's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Mippa is not wanting to be left. Harry swallowed. He crouched in front of the elf and met its gaze. We won't, he said, and he meant it with the weight of every broken promise he carried. Mippa's ears twitched. Harry Potter is being kind, it whispered, as if astonished. Harry stood. He looked at Hermione, at Ron, at Ginny. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion and fear, and something stubborn that refused to die. He thought of Neville's scrubbing steps under watch. He thought of Luna's tiny message, alive, watching. He thought of the thousands of names in the Ministry's lists. And he thought of Voldemort standing beneath a statue of dominance, expecting the world to bow. Harry took a slow breath. We do it, he said. Hermione's eyes closed briefly, like she was bracing herself. Ron swore softly. Ginny's grip tightened on her wand until her knuckles whitened. Outside the tunnel, above their heads, the world continued to obey. They were going to give it a reason not to. The Atrium was full of perfume and fear. Pure blood families gathered beneath the statue in robes that shimmered with wealth, velvet, embroidered hems, jewelry that caught the torchlight like captured stars. They looked like people attending a wedding, except their smiles were too stiff, their laughter too quick, and every conversation had the careful tone of those speaking near a sleeping predator. Harry stood among them with his head bowed, disguised as a minor ministry clerk. Hermione's spell had altered his face again, and he wore plain robes that blended into the dull gray of the bureaucracy. Under the robes, the invisibility cloak was folded tight against his chest, like a hidden heart. Hermione stood near the edge of the official platform, her hair pinned back, her posture perfect. Ron was nearby in his stolen uniform, eyes scanning the crowd with rigid control. Ginny watched from a balcony above, hidden behind a railing and a charm that blurred her features. Mippa was nowhere visible. That was the point. House elves moved best when no one remembered they existed. Pious Thickness stepped forward, scroll in trembling hands. He looked thinner than Harry remembered, his face shiny with sweat. He cleared his throat twice before words came out. "Witches and wizards," Thickness began, voice echoing off stone. "We gather today to mark the end of instability." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement but relief at hearing familiar rhythms. Speeches, ceremonies, the trappings of governance. People liked rituals. They liked the illusion that horrors could be made orderly if you put them on a schedule. Thickness continued, reading words that had clearly not been written by him. "To recognize the rightful authority that has restored peace." Harry's stomach clenched at the word peace. He could see the statues carved human forms beneath the stone witch and wizard's feet. Peace, here, meant bones under boots. Then Voldemort moved. He had been standing still near the statue, pale and silent, his presence like cold pressure. When he stepped forward, the crowd's murmurs died instantly. Even Thickness's voice faltered. Voldemort did not smile. He did not need to. He lifted the Elder Wand slightly, and the gesture alone commanded attention. His gaze swept the crowd like a blade testing throats. Harry kept his head down, fighting the instinct to touch his scar. Useless now. Silent. Voldemort spoke, and the sound was soft, but carried. "You will remember this day," he said, "because it is the day chaos ended." A shiver ran through the crowd. Some faces brightened with the sick relief of people who believed obedience might keep them safe. Others looked down, shoulders tightening. Harry's hands clenched under his robes. He felt Hermione's plan like a tight thread wrapped around his ribs. Wait, then cut. Thickness lifted the scroll again, voice shaking. "By decree of the Ministry of Magic." Voldemort turned slightly as if granting permission. Thickness swallowed and read the final line with the speed of someone hurling a stone off a cliff. "Lord Voldemort is hereby recognized as Supreme Sorcerer of the British Isles, rightful guardian of magical law." The words hung in the air. A declaration. An attempt to nail reality into place. A few people clapped, tentative at first, then more, as if applause could disguise terror. Others joined because not joining was dangerous. The sound grew into something like approval. Harry felt bile rise. This was the agreement Hermione had spoken of. This was the moment people chose survival over resistance, because resistance was expensive and applause was free. Harry's breath went slow and deliberate. He reached into his robes and let his fingers touch the edge of the cloak, grounding himself. Hermione's eyes flicked, barely, toward him. A tiny nod. "Now, bow." Harry stepped forward. He didn't throw back the cloak with dramatic flair. He didn't shout. He simply walked out of the crowd and lifted his head. The altered face shimmered as Hermione's charm dissolved, released by a wordless counterspell she'd anchored to his movement. For a heartbeat, Harry saw confusion ripple across the nearest faces. Then recognition struck like lightning. A gasp tore through the atrium. Someone screamed. Thickness's scroll slipped from his hands and fluttered to the floor. Voldemort went utterly still. Harry's pulse hammered. He stood beneath the statue's shadow, looking up at Voldemort. There were hundreds of wands in the room. Hundreds of eyes. Hundreds of held breaths. "Hello," Harry said, voice carrying in the shocked silence. Voldemort's pale face did not change, but Harry saw something flicker in his eyes. Something tight and cold. "Potter," Voldemort said softly, and the name sounded like poison. Harry swallowed. His throat was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to raise his wand, to strike first, to do something heroic and stupid. He held still instead. "I'm alive," Harry said, and felt the words land like a hammer. The crowd's fear shifted. It wasn't less fear. It was different fear. Uncertainty. Voldemort's voice was calm, almost gentle. "So it seems," he said. "How unfortunate." Harry's mouth tightened. "Unfortunate for your story," he said quietly. A murmur rippled. People looked at each other, confused by the word story, by the idea that this moment was not merely a duel, but a narrative breaking. Voldemort's fingers tightened around the Elder Wand. For a heartbeat, Harry saw the old anger flare, then contain itself again, like fire trapped behind glass. "You will die," Voldemort said, and it was not a threat. It was a statement of how the world should work. Harry lifted his wand slowly, not to attack, but because he knew what had to happen next. He looked up at Voldemort and held his gaze. "Try," Harry said. For a moment, the world held its breath. Voldemort raised the Elder Wand. Harry's heartbeat was so loud he thought the crowd might hear it. He could taste metal in his mouth. He lifted his own wand, not with confidence but with necessity, and pointed it at Voldemort's chest. Voldemort's eyes were black and endless. "Avada." The syllables began. Green light sparked at the wand tip, and faltered. It wasn't dramatic. There was no explosion, no thunder. The curse simply stuttered, like a flame in wind, flickering into a thin, sickly stream that snapped and died before it crossed the space between them. A sound went through the atrium. Not a scream, not a cheer, but a collective, involuntary exhale of shock. Voldemort stared at the Elder Wand as if it had betrayed him. Harry's pulse slammed. He almost couldn't believe what he had seen. Draco had been right. The wand hesitated. Voldemort's face tightened, the calm cracking just enough to reveal rage beneath. He lifted the wand again, faster, more forceful. The air around the wand tip seemed to bend with power. Harry's instinct screamed to dive, to run, to throw up a shield that wouldn't matter. Hermione's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear as if she were slicing a thread. "Now!" The diversion erupted. From the far end of the atrium, a series of spells detonated, not lethal, not aimed at people, but at symbols. Black banners burst into flame. The new statue's base cracked, stone splintering. A stack of ministry pamphlets exploded into a storm of ash. People screamed and scattered. Pure-blood nobles clutched their robes and stumbled, faces twisted with outrage and fear. Aurors shouted orders, trying to form lines. Dementors shifted uncertainly, their slow glide interrupted by chaos. Harry stood still, because the chaos was their cover, and he had one more thing to do. He looked at Voldemort, who was still staring at the Elder Wand with a fury that made his shoulders tense. Voldemort's control was slipping, in front of everyone, in the middle of his coronation. Harry lifted his voice. "It doesn't belong to you," he said. Voldemort's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "Silence." Harry's voice did not shake. "You can't even kill me with it," he said, and felt the words strike the crowd like a spell. "You can't make the world obey if your own wand won't." The sentence wasn't entirely true. Voldemort could kill Harry with another wand, perhaps, but he didn't have another wand that mattered. And the Elder Wand was a symbol now, not just a tool. Symbols were the battlefield. Voldemort's face twisted. For the first time since the Great Hall, Harry saw Voldemort's composure fracture. Avada Kedavra. This time the curse erupted in full, a torrent of green light. Harry shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Red light slammed into the green. The spells collided in midair with a crack like splitting wood. The force of it slammed into Harry's arms, jolting him backward. The floor slid under his boots. His shoulder struck stone. For a heartbeat, the atrium glowed with the clash of magic. Green and red braided together like violence and resistance. Then the green light snapped, whipping backward like a lash striking the hand that held it. The curse didn't hit Voldemort. Not fully. It struck the air beside him, slamming into the statue with explosive force. Stone shattered. The carved throne cracked. A piece of the statue's face broke off and hit the floor with a heavy final thud. Voldemort staggered half a step, more from shock than impact. His grip tightened on the Elder Wand. His expression was not pain. It was disbelief. The Elder Wand had not done what he commanded. The crowd saw it. Harry could feel their disbelief rippling like a wave, breaking the fragile agreement thickness had tried to cement. A shriek tore through the atrium, someone shouting Voldemort's name, terrified, outraged, as if the mere possibility of his weakness was a wound. Hermione grabbed Harry's arm as he regained his footing. Her face was pale, eyes blazing. "Move!" Ron slammed a blasting curse into a wall, collapsing stone to block pursuing horrors. Ginny's bad bogey hex flew from the balcony, a flash of red that sent a Death Eater clutching his face and screaming. Harry's heart hammered. He wanted to look back, to see Voldemort's face, to savor the crack in his certainty. But Hermione was dragging him toward the service corridor. Mippa appeared like a flicker, eyes wild, hands outstretched. "Now, now, now," Mippa squeaked, voice shrill with fear. Harry stumbled into the narrow seam behind the wall, the cloak thrown over his head. Hermione and Ron followed, Ginny vaulting down a stairwell to join them, her face flushed with adrenaline. Behind them, in the atrium, Voldemort's voice rose. Not a shout, but a sound colder than fury. "Find them." The wall closed. The corridor swallowed them. The Ministry's noise became muffled, distant. Harry's lungs burned. His hands shook. Hermione's grip was iron on his sleeve. Ron's breathing was ragged. Ginny's eyes were bright. They had done it. They had cracked the story. And now the story would bite back. They ran until the Ministry's wards stopped humming in their bones. The service tunnel twisted like an intestine, damp stone scraping their shoulders. Hermione ran first, her breath sharp, her shoes slipping on wet ground. Ron shoved doors shut behind them, sealing corridors with spells that cracked in the air like whips. Ginny moved like fire, turning to fling hexes into the darkness whenever a sound suggested pursuit. Mippa popped in and out, guiding them with frantic gestures, appearing ahead with wide eyes and vanishing again, a heartbeat in elf form. Harry kept the cloak over his head, not because he wanted invisibility, but because he didn't trust his face not to be recognized if a patrol caught sight of them. His mind replayed the moment in the atrium again and again, the green curse faltering, Voldemort's expression tightening, the statue cracking. Voldemort had been embarrassed. In public. Harry's stomach twisted with a sick, guilty thrill. Part of him wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to vomit, because he could already imagine the retaliation. Voldemort would not accept humiliation. Voldemort would bleed the world until the world apologized. When they finally burst out into night air, it was through a forgotten grate behind a row of abandoned shops. The street was empty. Rain fell in thin sheets. The city's Muggle lights glowed hazily through mist. Hermione bent over, hands on her knees, breathing hard. Ron leaned against the wall, eyes squeezed shut, chest heaving. Ginny stood upright, scanning the street, wand up, ready to strike even now. Harry pulled the cloak off his head and sucked in air that tasted of wet stone and smoke. His hands trembled. He forced them to still. Hermione looked up at him, rain on her lashes. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a fierce, exhausted triumph. "It worked," she breathed. Ron let out a shaky laugh, disbelieving. "Did you see their faces?" Ginny's grin was sharp. They looked like someone had told them the sun can fall. Harry swallowed. The victory tasted strange. "People got hurt," he said, because he couldn't let himself forget the cost even for one night. Hermione's expression softened, pain flickering. "Not many," she said quietly. "Not like it could have been. We chose the moment well." "Day, none turn, be." Ron's voice was rough. "We didn't kill anyone." Ginny's eyes flashed. "We could have." Harry shook his head, rain streaking down his face. "No," he said, voice firm. "If we start killing like that, public, symbolic, We become what he says we are. Rebels, terrorists, monsters, and the story changes in his favor. Ron stared at him. Harry, he's killing people anyway. I know, Harry said, and the words hurt. Hermione stepped closer, voice low. The point was never to be kinder than him, she said. The point is to make people see him as fallible, to make them stop worshipping the fear. Nine. Harry closed his eyes briefly. Behind his eyelids he saw Voldemort's face at the moment the curse faltered. Shock, then rage, then something colder. Calculation. He'll come for us, Ron said, stating the obvious like it was a comfort. At least the shape of danger was familiar. Ginny's jaw tightened. Let him. He has to look. Hermione flinched. He'll punish people for our escape, she warned. Harry's chest tightened. The old instinct rose. Sacrifice yourself. End the pursuit. Spare others. He forced himself to breathe through it. We keep moving, Harry said. We pull people out faster. We spread the whisper wider. We don't let him make this about punishing people until they beg him for order. Ron's face hardened. He'll try. Hermione nodded, rain dripping from her hair. He'll tighten control. He'll call it protection. Ginny's eyes were bright, almost fierce with satisfaction. And every time he tightens, she said, he shows he's scared. Harry looked at his friends, their soaked clothes, their bruised faces, their stubborn fire. He felt something settle in him that hadn't been there before. Not hope exactly, but momentum. They had struck the first blow in a different war. They moved again, slipping through alleys, changing routes, using Mippa's hidden seams. Behind them, the ministry would be roaring. The newspapers would be censored. The streets would be patrolled. But somewhere, someone who had clapped at Voldemort's coronation would be remembering the moment the Elder Wand hesitated. Somewhere, someone would be thinking, if he can't even kill Harry Potter. And in that doubt, the story would grow teeth. Rumors spread faster than laws. Within a week, the phrase began appearing where ministry posters could not be watched constantly. Scratched into brick with the point of a wand. Written in chalk on alley stones. Etched into the underside of benches in Diagon Alley. He lived. Sometimes there was a crude drawing of a lightning bolt. Sometimes a stag. Sometimes nothing but the words. Small and defiant. The ministry tried to stamp it out. Aurors tore down posters and scrubbed walls with scouring spells. Dementors glided through streets like threats made flesh. There were arrests. There were public trials. There were new decrees announced with crisp official language and enforced with the bluntness of fear. But every decree was also an admission. They are afraid of a whisper, Hermione murmured, reading between the lines. They are afraid of an idea. Harry found himself in places he'd never imagined when he was a schoolboy, dreaming of defeating a dark lord. Cramped rooms above closed shops, basements beneath Muggle laundromats, narrow alleys where wizarding poverty gathered like rot. Voldemort's rule had not made everyone rich and powerful. It had simply rearranged who was allowed to be safe. They moved people out in small numbers, because small numbers were harder to notice. Mippa guided them through hidden corridors. Hermione forged papers with frightening efficiency. Ron learned the patrol patterns like he'd been born into guerrilla war. Ginny became a ghost with fire in her hands, appearing to cover escapes and vanishing before the net could close. Harry spoke to people. It was the part he hated most, because it meant looking into eyes that asked him to be something he wasn't sure he could be anymore. A mother with hollow cheeks and shaking hands clutched her child and whispered, "Is it true?" As if the answer might keep her alive. An old wizard with a limp pressed Harry's hand and said, "We thought you'd left us," and Harry's chest tightened as if he'd been punched. A teenage girl stared at Harry like he was a myth and said, "My brother says you're a lie," and Harry didn't know whether to be relieved or wounded. He didn't give speeches. He didn't promise easy victory. He didn't tell them to rise up and fight, because he'd seen what happened when brave people fought against power that didn't care. He told them where to go. He told them how to hide. He told them quietly, that being alive was an act of resistance now. At night, he lay awake and listened to Hermione whispering to herself as she worked, to Ron's restless shifting, to Ginny's soft breathing. He thought of Neville and Luna at Hogwarts, still trapped. He thought of Narcissa and Draco at Malfoy Manor, still under Voldemort's gaze. And he thought of Voldemort, somewhere in the heart of his government, tightening control, hunting for a rumor like it was a serpent he couldn't strangle. The crack in the story was widening. Not because they had destroyed Voldemort's power. He still had Aurors, Dementors, laws, prisons. But because they had made his power look like what it was, a thing that needed constant reinforcement. People began to say Voldemort's name less like a force of nature and more like a man. People began to glance over their shoulders before bowing. People began to whisper, sometimes even with a hint of hope, that perhaps the war wasn't truly finished. The Ministry responded by announcing a new cleansing, a public act of unity, a show of strength. Hermione stole the announcement off a board and read it aloud, her voice flat. Mandatory attendance in Diagon Alley, she said. A demonstration of loyalty. All registered wands to be presented for verification. Punishment for non-compliance. Ron swore. They're trying to flush people out. Ginny's eyes narrowed. They're trying to make people prove obedience. Harry stared at the announcement until the words blurred. Mandatory attendance. Verification. Loyalty. A trap made of bureaucracy. Hermione looked up, and her eyes were sharp. This is about you, she said quietly. They're trying to draw you out again, to force you into another public moment so they can control the narrative this time. Harry's stomach tightened. Voldemort would learn. He would adapt. He would try to turn the story back in his favor. Ron's jaw clenched. So we don't go. Ginny shook her head. We go, she said, but not the way they expect. Hermione looked between them, then at Harry. We can't keep doing public spectacles, she warned. We got lucky. The wand hesitated. It might not hesitate again. Harry touched his scar. Nothing. He felt the absence like a cold space. He thought of Draco's whispered words. A ceremony matters. Voldemort's government was building rituals to cement obedience. If Harry wanted to unmake the story, he needed to strike where rituals mattered most. Harry looked up at his friends. We won't go to Diagon Alley, he said slowly. Not for them. Ron frowned. Then where? Harry's voice was quiet, certain. We go to Hogwarts. Ginny's eyes widened. Ron swore. Hermione's face went very still. Harry, Hermione whispered, fear sharp in her voice. Hogwarts is a symbol, Harry finished. And symbols are where stories live. He could see Neville's scrubbing steps under watch. He could see Luna's distant eyes. He could see Voldemort's banners on the towers. If Voldemort wanted to be the world, he would claim Hogwarts as his crown. Harry intended to take it back. Not with a battle, but with a revelation. They returned to Hogwarts through the same wound Aberforth had used to pull Harry out. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Hermione's lantern threw jittery light on stone walls. Ron carried a bag that clinked softly with potion vials and stolen tools. Ginny moved ahead, silent and focused, wand raised. Harry wore the cloak over his shoulders, not fully invisible, but shadowed enough to melt into the tunnel's darkness. Hermione held the DA coin in her palm, its surface warm. The tiny letters shifted as Luna sent short, careful messages. Back passage clear. Watchers at gate. Amicus near Great Hall. Harry felt his throat tighten. Hogwarts was alive with watchers now, its corridors patrolled like prison halls. The castle that had once sheltered secrets was being strangled by them. They emerged into the Hog's head cellar and climbed into the pub's back room, where Aberforth waited with a grim expression. You're insane, Aberforth said flatly. Probably, Ginny replied. Hermione ignored Aberforth's glare and unrolled a crude map of Hogwarts. We need Neville and Luna, she said. We need to get them out quietly if we can. But we also need something else. Ron looked at Harry. We're really doing this? Harry nodded once. Aberforth's eyes narrowed. What? Harry's voice was quiet. We show the school he can't own it. Aberforth snorted. He owns the bloody ministry. Hermione's eyes flashed. He owns fear, she said. Not everything. They moved before dawn, slipping back into the tunnel. At a hidden door behind a tapestry, they paused. Hermione pressed her palm to the stone. A charm shivered in the air. The door clicked open. Hogwarts greeted them with cold, stale air, and the faint smell of smoke that never seemed to leave the stones. Torchlight flickered along the corridor, harsher than the warm candlelight Harry remembered. The portraits on the walls watched with wary eyes. Some pretended to sleep. Some stared openly, afraid and curious. Harry pulled the cloak fully over his head. They moved like ghosts. Ginny led, using her knowledge of the castle's secret routes. Ron stayed close behind Hermione, his hand hovering near his wand, ready. Hermione whispered spells under her breath, masking their footsteps, dampening the sound of breath. Harry listened to the castle's quiet, distant voices, a door slamming, the clink of chains somewhere far away. They reached a stairwell and paused as footsteps approached. A group of students filed past in drab robes, heads bowed. Harry saw one boy's hands, red and raw, as if scrubbed with harsh soap. Punishment marks. One girl glanced up briefly, her eyes flicking to the empty space where Harry stood. For a second, Harry thought she could see him. His heart seized. Then she looked away quickly, terrified of being caught looking at anything. The group passed. The corridor fell quiet again. Hermione's coin warmed. Letters appeared. Neville in trophy room. Luna near kitchens. Careful. They split. Ron and Ginny went toward the kitchens, because Ginny knew the way and Ron could handle whatever waited there. Hermione and Harry headed for the trophy room because Hermione's mind mapped corridors faster than any marauder's map. The castle seemed to resist them, not magically but emotionally. Every stone held memory. Harry felt the weight of the battle, the screams, the smoke. He wondered how Hogwarts endured being turned into a cage. They reached the trophy room door. Hermione whispered a spell, unlocking it quietly. The door creaked open. Inside, trophies gleamed faintly in the dim light like captured moments of glory that now felt grotesque. The room smelled of dust and polish. Neville was on his knees, scrubbing the floor with a rag. His hands were red, his knuckles cracked. His face was bruised, but his posture, somehow, was still stubborn. Harry's chest tightened so hard it hurt. Hermione stepped forward, hood down, whispering, "Neville." Neville's head snapped up. For a heartbeat, his face was blank, shock wiping it clean. Then his eyes widened. "Hermione," he breathed. Hermione crouched beside him, grabbing his arm. "Quiet. We're getting you out." Neville stared past her, eyes flicking to the empty space beside her. "Harry," he whispered, voice shaking with disbelief. Harry pulled the cloak back just enough to reveal his face. Neville's breath caught. His eyes filled with tears he did not let fall. "You're alive," Harry said softly. Neville's mouth trembled. "They said?" "I know." Harry swallowed. "We don't have time." Neville nodded quickly, scrubbing rag dropped forgotten. His hands shook as he stood. "Luna. Ron and Ginny are getting her," Hermione said. A voice echoed in the corridor outside, Amicus's harsh bark, ordering someone to move faster. Footsteps approached. Hermione's eyes sharpened. "We have to go." Harry pulled the cloak over Neville's shoulders. Neville blinked, then understood, stepping close to Harry so the cloak could cover them both. It was awkward, cramped, but possible. They slipped out of the trophy room and into the corridor. The footsteps grew louder. Harry held his breath. Hermione pressed herself against the wall, wand ready. Neville's body trembled beside Harry, but he stayed silent. Amicus Carrow stomped past, muttering about lazy students and blood and discipline. His wand was in his hand. His eyes were narrow, predatory. He passed so close Harry could smell him. Sour sweat and cheap liquor. For a moment, Harry felt the old rage flare, hot and dangerous. He wanted to strike. He forced it down. Not yet. Amicus moved on. The corridor exhaled. Hermione looked at Harry, eyes wide with relief and fear. "This is working," she whispered. Harry tightened his grip on the cloak. "We haven't done the hard part," he murmured. Because getting Neville out was only rescue. Taking Hogwarts back from Voldemort's story would require something else entirely. They gathered the students in the Great Hall because Hogwarts still obeyed the shape of its own rituals. Amicus Carrow's punishment system relied on fear, and fear relied on witnesses. So when something went wrong, when a prisoner vanished, when whispers spread, when the castle seemed to breathe wrong, he summoned everyone he could control and made them watch. He made them stand in lines beneath the broken banners, made them feel small beneath the old ceiling. Harry knew this because Luna had told Hermione in a message that had arrived like a heartbeat in the night. Amicus panicking, calling all to hall. He thinks someone helping. He wants example. Panic was useful. Panic made men predictable. They moved through corridors like smoke and placed themselves where they needed to be. Hermione her side door, wand hidden but ready. Ron and Ginny near the teacher's table, faces hard. Neville and Luna in the crowd, cloaked and trembling, alive. Harry stood at the center aisle beneath the cloak, heart hammering so hard he thought it might reveal him. The great hall was colder than he remembered. The enchanted ceiling was dark, storm clouds rolling overhead. Torches burned low, their light harsh on frightened faces. Students stood in rows, heads bowed, eyes wide. Some looked thinner. Some had bruises that weren't hidden very well. The air smelled of fear and old smoke. Amicus stomped to the front, wand raised. "Silence," he barked. "Silence, you little." The doors at the far end of the hall opened. The room froze. Voldemort entered. He did not stride like a soldier. He glided like a certainty. His black robes barely stirred. The Elder Wand was in his hand, pale against his fingers. Behind him came Death Eaters and Ministry Aurors, their faces grim, their wands out. Nagini slithered at Voldemort's feet like a living shadow, her eyes gleaming. Harry's breath caught. The last time he had seen Voldemort in this hall, the world had ended. Now Voldemort walked into Hogwarts as if it were a conquered country. Amicus dropped into a bow so fast it was almost comical. The students flinched as one, terror rippling. Voldemort's gaze swept the room. It paused, just a fraction, in the center aisle. Harry felt it like a cold hand on his throat. Even under the cloak, even hidden, he felt exposed. Voldemort spoke, voice soft. "I am told," he said, "that someone believes they can steal from me." No one moved. No one breathed. Voldemort's eyes glinted. "I am told that my victory is being questioned." Harry felt Hermione's presence at the edge of the hall like a steady flame. He felt Ron's tension, Ginny's sharp readiness. He felt Neville trembling behind him under the cloak's edge. Voldemort lifted the Elder Wand slightly. "If anyone has forgotten what it costs to defy me," he said, "I will remind you." The words were calm. Was the most terrifying part. Voldemort did not need to shout. He was the government now. He could kill with paperwork or with a curse. It was all the same. Harry's hands clenched beneath the cloak. His heart hammered. He thought of the Atrium, the faltering green light. He thought of the statue cracking. He thought of the rumors spreading. He thought of Neville scrubbing floors. He thought of thousands of names on lists. He stepped forward. The cloak slid back from his head. A ripple of shock went through the crowd, as if the entire great hall had inhaled at once. Heads snapped up. Eyes widened. A girl dropped the candle she was holding. Wax splattered on stone. Harry stood in the center aisle, exposed beneath torchlight. Voldemort went utterly still. For a heartbeat, Harry saw it again. The flicker of disbelief, the tightening of control around rage. Voldemort's face was carved ice, but his eyes were a void that hated being surprised. "Potter," Voldemort said softly. Harry lifted his wand, not in attack, but in readiness. His voice carried. "You don't own this place," he said. A murmur trembled through the students. Neville's breath hitched behind him. Luna's eyes were wide, luminous with something like awe. Voldemort's mouth curled slightly. "You think a castle matters?" Harry's voice was steady. "You think it doesn't," he replied. "That's why you'll lose it." Voldemort's fingers tightened around the Elder Wand. "You are making a habit of embarrassing yourself," he said, voice soft with contempt. "You cannot win. You are alive only because I have allowed it." Harry felt the old fear flare, instinctive and sharp. He forced himself to breathe through it. "Then kill me," Harry said. A whisper surged through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Students stared. Some looked horrified. Some looked hungry for hope. Voldemort lifted the Elder Wand. Harry's heartbeat hammered. The air seemed to tighten. Hermione's wand rose in the corner. Ron and Ginny shifted, prepared to move. Neville's breath trembled. Voldemort's voice was calm. "Avada Kedavra." Green light erupted, and hesitated. Not completely this time. It flared, flickered, fought to exist, but the wand tip sputtered as if refusing. The green light thinned and snapped into nothing, leaving only a faint crackle in the air like a dying ember. A stunned silence fell, heavier than any scream. Harry stood perfectly still, his wand still raised, his breath loud in his ears. Voldemort stared at the Elder Wand. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed the faces of the Death Eaters behind him. Not doubt in Voldemort's power. No one dared that. But confusion. A crack in the choreography. Harry felt the crowd's shock shift into something else. The realization, the sudden, electric possibility that the Dark Lord's will was not absolute. Voldemort's eyes lifted, slow and murderous, meeting Harry's. He did not shout. He did not lose control. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had decided to change the rules. "If this wand will not kill you," Voldemort said softly, "then I will." His free hand rose. A Death Eater stepped forward with another wand trembling. Voldemort snatched it without looking. Harry's stomach dropped. Of course. Of course Voldemort would adapt. Of course he would not cling to a symbol if the symbol betrayed him. Hermione's voice cut through the hall, sharp. "Harry." But Harry wasn't watching Hermione. He was watching the crowd. He was watching the students' faces, the fear, the dawning hope, the fragile disbelief. He had given them the crack. Now he had to give them a way through it. Harry lifted his voice. "Remember this," he said loud enough for every student to hear. "He can't even make his own wand obey him." Voldemort's borrowed wand lifted. Harry did not flinch. He raised his wand and cast one spell, not at Voldemort, not at Death Eaters, but at the ceiling. Lumos Maxima. Light erupted overhead, dazzling and sudden. The great hall flooded with brilliant white, burning away shadows. Students cried out, shielding their eyes. Death Eaters cursed, blinded. Dementors at the doors recoiled, hissing. In the blinding flare, Ginny's voice rose, fierce and commanding. "Run!" Chaos exploded. Students surged, breaking lines, shoving past each other towards side doors Hermione had already unlocked. Ron blasted a section of wall, opening a passage Hermione had mapped. Neville shouted, voice raw, rallying those nearest him. Luna moved like a dream through the crowd, guiding younger students with a calm that seemed impossible. Harry threw the cloak back over his head and vanished into the white glare. He felt spells whip past him. Stunners, curses, shouts. but the light made aim sloppy, panic ruining precision. Voldemort's voice cut through it all, cold and furious. "Stop them!" Harry ran dodgy. Not away from Hogwarts, through it, through the secret arteries of the castle, through passages that belonged to students and ghosts and conspiracies older than Voldemort's rule. He could hear the stampede behind him, the roar of freedom breaking its chains. He could hear Death Eaters shouting. He could hear Amicus screaming in impotent rage. And beneath it all, he could hear something else. The sound of a story changing. As Harry sprinted into darkness, cloak billowing like a shadow, he felt the truth settle into him with brutal clarity. He had not defeated Voldemort tonight. Voldemort would still hunt. Voldemort would still kill. Voldemort would still rule, tomorrow in the Ministry with decrees and dementors and borrowed wands. But Hogwarts had seen him hesitate. Hogwarts had seen him adapt like a man, not a god. And Hogwarts had run. In the corridor ahead, Hermione's voice called his name. Urgent. Ron's footsteps thundered. Ginny's laughter, wild, fierce, rang out once, startlingly bright in the darkness. Harry's lungs burned. His heart hammered. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a spark in dry grass. And somewhere behind him, in the great hall, Voldemort stood beneath cracked stone and flickering torchlight, holding a wand that was not his, surrounded by the sound of escape, watching his peace dissolve into motion. The war had ended, they said. Harry ran through Hogwarts' veins and knew with cold certainty that the real war had only just begun.